Hello, my name is Alex Hebert. I am a seminary student in Regent University. This is the cosmogony course that I'm in, and I am so excited to share this talk with you about the integration, the overlap between science and scripture. Have you ever looked up at the stars and wondered how it all began? Why are we here on this floating rock, and is there a God? You see, I believe that as Bible-believing Christians, we look to the scriptures to tell us these answers. See, we believe that the Bible is the final word on all things. And partly because, and I think this is amazing about scripture and about my beliefs as a Christian, is that, man, if one thing is wrong, if one thing is a lie, then the whole thing kind of crumbles. Yet the Bible holds true, and it holds true in every single case, in every area of what it means to be a human being. However, I find that there's a tension that has formed over the years, especially surrounding the questions of origin and creation, science and scripture. There's this tension that's there. Science claims that the earth is really, really old. Actually, the earth is about 4 billion years old and the universe 13 billion. That's the claims of science. And science also claims that we as human beings, we originated, we came from a common ancestor. We evolved from a common ancestor. However, in Genesis 1 in the scriptures, it kind of seemingly paints this picture that God created everything, including you and I, in 7 days, supernaturally, poof-like miracles by his hand. So what do? These are two different claims, it seems like. What do we do with the tension between science and scripture? How do we reconcile the two? Or can they even be reconciled? You see, for the Christian, I think oftentimes science can make us feel like our faith is under attack. Many have left the faith because they haven't found sufficient answers in the Bible in light of scientific claims. But I think of 1 Peter 3:15 whenever I think about us as Christians being able to give a confident answer for our faith. 1 Peter 3:15 goes on to say, always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. But do this with gentleness and respect. You see, I believe that there is alignment between scripture and science. And guess what? It's not a forced alignment. It's not a coerced alignment. It's not even a coincidence in alignment, but very intentional. See, scripture that was written thousands of years ago speaks on nature and the creator, and scientific discoveries align with it over the years. And so for these next 20 minutes or so, I would love to present how scripture and science align by giving 4 major creation views. And I want to emphasize one in particular. But before we go into these creation views, what I would like to do is lay out and give us an understanding of the science-faith landscape. How do we make sense of science and scripture? And so there's different approaches. There's different ways that people in the past have done this. One of the ways is that some believe that scripture and science are in direct conflict. Some believe that science and faith are in a war, in a battle, making two very different claims, as I mentioned. That they're not saying the same thing. So either science or scripture is telling the truth. Which one is it? Make your decision. Right? So that seems to be in the landscape of how we reconcile science and faith, to just say that they're at war with one another. And so, believe me, there are people out there, i.e., look at your Facebook group or page, and they believe that it is their mission to call people back to the truth, back to scientific inquiry, and leave behind the religious mythology and myths between the God of the Bible and Odin. There's no difference. See, others believe, though, that we need to go back to our American roots, into the Bible alone. This mixture of nationalism and Christianity. Either way, there's this in the science and faith landscape. There is a belief that the science and faith are at war. They're at conflict, and you better pick your side. Not only that, there's another view out there. There's a view of separate magisteria. See, some believe that science and scripture are not in conflict because guess what? They're in two very different realms in and of itself. They're in separate fields. It's like talking about cars and groceries. They have nothing to do with each other. And that's the belief of separate magisteria. Some believe that if you're going to talk about science and talk about science, don't talk about religion because that has nothing to do with this. See, science isn't talking about anything with matters of spirit, matters of immaterial. That's not even what it's talking about, so don't worry about it. And vice versa, that scripture doesn't really tell us anything about the natural world. That's not what it was meant to do. That it's a religious book, it's a spiritual book, and it should stay that way. That's the belief of separate magisteria. Maybe that's your belief. Maybe you simply believe that science and faith, how do you relieve the tension? Because there is no tension, because they're in two very different worlds. Not only that, there are some, though, that believe on the opposite end of the spectrum, that they're not in conflict, and they're not even two separate fields. Some believe that there's actually what is called fusion, that they are completely overlapped. See, on the other end of the spectrum, there are some who believe that science and scripture are talking about the exact same thing. And with this, we call this hard concordism, that scripture and science are saying the same exact thing. There's an attempt to make every single piece of scientific discovery in scripture say that. So if they discover something about koala bears, they're going to try to figure out a way to make scripture say that, right? And I found that they'll even do this to the extent of eisegesis, of making scripture fit. This is about reading science into scripture. This idea of fusion, that there's complete overlap between science and scripture, right? Well, there's a couple more views. Another view of this is a complementary view. How do we reconcile science and faith? Well, there's another view of this. It's complementary. This view suggests that there's very little to say about nature in scripture, and nature has very little to say about the nature of God. And so scripture talks about nature having a beginning, but doesn't touch on origin issues. There's very little overlap. So fusion says that there's complete overlap, while complementary view says that there's very little overlap. Then there's this idea of constructive integration. And what this means is this, that there is the last view, that there is a proposal that there is great overlap between science and faith, but not complete overlap. But yet there's not just a little overlap like in complementary. Constructive integration says that there's a lot of overlap between scripture and science, right? Where scripture doesn't talk about certain things found in nature, like we're not going to find scripture talking about koala bears or the microwave or stuff like that. And guess what? Nature is not going to talk about the deep points in theology. It's not going to touch on that. However, scripture does make a lot of general claims on nature, and nature does reveal general attributes of God. So there is substantial, significant overlap between scripture and nature. However, they're not complete overlap, and it's not very little. There's significant overlap, and where they overlap, there is great harmony. And this is where we get into the belief of dual revelation, this doctrine of dual revelation. That there are two books of Revelation that reveal truth about God. There is the book of Scripture, where we as Christians are very familiar with, but also there's the book of nature. And so we know that the book of Scripture says a ton about who God is and what God is like and what he's done specifically, right? It's special, specific revelation. However, we also believe that nature has something to say about who God is and what he's like. Listen to this. Listen to Romans 1:20. It says, "For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, the things that aren't intuitive, the things that aren't seen, like aren't seen, like we can't see God. God is spirit. So how do we see this attribute with him? Well, these invisible qualities are clearly seen, being understood from what has been made." Right? His eternal power, his divine nature can be seen like a thumbprint, like a potter's wheel. You can see a thumbprint. You can see God's nature, his thumbprint in his creation, in what he's made. And we believe that. And Paul goes so far as to say in Romans 1:20 that people are without excuse. That we can't deny that God isn't present. Why? Because we can look at his creation. We can look at creation itself, at nature itself, what is seen, and we can see what is unseen and what is seen. God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and his divine nature. And I tell you, if as you look at nature, as you look at the stars, and as you think about all that's around us, as you think about the platypus, what's that? As you think about how our blood cells, how our DNA is arranged, as you think about all that is out there, it does make one wonder about the nature of God, about the majesty of God, that there's something more here than just what we see. And so I don't know what it is about human beings, but we are constantly asking the existential questions, aren't we? We're constantly wondering and thinking and searching for meaning behind what we see. And what we see, and what Scripture testifies to, is we see the qualities of God in creation. That's the book of nature. And so dual revelation says two things: that we can get revelation of God, not just in Scripture. Yes, very specifically in Scripture. Yes, it's the special revelation, God revealing himself to man. But we can also get it in his creation, in nature. That as we gaze at nature, we can see his invisible qualities. We can see his majesty, his power, his divine nature. See, Scripture has something to say about nature, and nature has something to say about God. And so there is harmony where we see overlap. Again, Scripture is not a science book, but it does make general claims about nature. And where those claims are made, it is incredible, the harmony that we find in scientific discovery that confirms what Scripture says. It's incredible, the overlap that's there. But again, it's not, I don't believe that it's fusion where there's this complete overlap, right? But I also believe that it's not just complementary where they just simply complement one another. No, I believe that there is great overlap. There is harmony in where Scripture says and where science is discovering. And so with that background, I want to introduce to us the four major views on this harmony and overlap between Scripture and science. And so I want us to talk about the four major creation views for these next remaining moments together. And so as we think about these four major views, what we're really answering, where we're really trying to reconcile science and Scripture, are really centered around two things. The first thing is this: it's centered around this idea of the age of the earth. How old really is the earth? How old is it? And then two, are we the product of evolutionary change, macroevolution? This idea of speciation, this idea of us having a universal common ancestor that we came from. So from a microbe to a microbiologist, right? So we came from monkeys. You've heard this said, right? And so these are the two scientific claims. This is the core of scientific study, and these are the assumptions that science makes whenever it does its inquiry. That the earth is old, the universe is old, and guess what? Evolutionary change. Things evolve and transform, and things have a common ancestor. The first view that I want to present is called the young earth creationist view. Young earth creationist view. And so this young earth creationist view, they deny both scientific claims. They deny the age of the earth is old, and they deny evolution. They deny macroevolution. And so young earth creationists are interesting. They tend to see Genesis chapters 1 through 11 as the only text referring to creation. It's the only text. And so they believe that God created everything in 6 literal 24-hour days around 6,000 years ago. And they get that 6,000 based upon using the genealogy of the Bible back down to Adam. And so they hold fast to a literal reading of Genesis 1 creation week. They see God doing proof-like miracles to make his creation as we know it. And so they believe that God, in these 6 days and 24-hour days, God made everything. Now, this does beg the question, though. You may ask, and what I'm asking, then why does the earth look old? Why are there layers and why are there tree rings that are really, really, really old? Why is that? And so they would say, their explanation to this defense is they would say that the flood is what caused layers in the earth as to make the earth appear old. See, young earth creationists lean heavily on Scripture to explain nature and creation, and they deny and refute any scientific data interpreted that contradicts Genesis 1 through 11. They hold fast to that. They lean heavily on the scriptural claims and holding fast to a certain hermeneutic or exegesis, interpretation of the scripture. And anything that comes, any scientific data, interpretation of scientific data that comes against that scripture hermeneutic or exegesis, they will deny it. They will refute it. That is the young earth creationist view. That is how they attempt to answer this tension between science and faith. The next view I want to talk about is the exact opposite on the other end of young earth creationism, and that is evolution creationists. They accept, the evolution creationists accept both claims on the age of the earth and evolution. They accept both claims. Whereas the young earth creationists deny both claims, the evolution creationists accepts both claims. They see God using the gradual process of evolution over the course of billions of years to create the diversity of life that we see today. They push for more of a contextual reading of scripture. And so they hold fast that when the authors of the Bible wrote, they were writing for a particular instance in historical time and context. And they don't believe in reading the Bible or the Bible having a fuller sense or a fuller meaning today. They believe that the way it was written to the original audience is what the message meant. And so they don't believe that the scripture makes hardly any scientific claims. You would say almost like it's a complimentary view more than anything. And so they see Genesis 1 written primarily to combat the polytheistic worldview of the time that it was written. All these ancient Near Eastern mythologies about creation, and that the writer of Genesis, which most likely is Moses, wrote it to combat that view, showing the truth that the one true God of Israel, was the creator of all. And it wasn't many gods, it was one God. And he's both creator of all, and he alone did it. He has the power to do it. And so they see God guiding the course of evolution, but reject any poof-like creation acts of God, where young earth creationists lean heavily that God created through these poof-like miracles that, let there be light, and there was poof-like light. And so God strictly uses, for the evolution creationists, he strictly uses the natural laws and constants and processes that he made in the beginning to create. And so God used what he was already there to shape and create the diversity that we see today. And so evolutionary creationists lean more towards science to shape our understanding of creation rather than scripture. So for the young earth creationists, it's a hard, fast, clinging to a certain scriptural hermeneutic to tell us about creation. Rather, the evolution creationists will lean heavily on on science rather, allowing scripture to be only read in its context, to its original audience, and it stays there. The next two claims are interesting. This next view, or creationist view, is one in which I personally lean heavily towards, and it's the old earth creationist view. So again, what are we talking about? We're trying to reconcile scripture and science. And what I'm presenting to you are the four major views of scripture and science, how they're reconciled. How do we alleviate the tension, right? And again, they're answering the question of, are they in conflict? Are they fused together? Are there direct overlap? Is there partial overlap, just complementary? Are they two separate magisteria? Or are they integrative? Are they constructive integration? Are they have significant overlap and there's harmony, but it doesn't say everything about nature, and it doesn't say everything about God? Where do we set on this? The reason I like old earth creationists before I present it to you is I find that it leans towards constructive integration, where the Bible, it gives room for the Bible to say that it doesn't say anything about microwaves or koala bears. However, what it does say about creation goes past just Genesis 1 through 11 and into the rest of the Bible. And the claims that it does make has been backed by scientific inquiry and discovery. The old earth creationist view, also known as the day-age view, they accept the age of the earth, but they reject evolution. And so again, the two things that this is centered around is the age of the earth, is it old or not, and evolution. Is it true or not? Macroevolution, speciation in that way. And so the old earth or the day age view, they accept the age of the earth, but they reject evolution. They see scripture making scientific claims. And I love how it's said that scripture has this predictive power that scientific discoveries would later confirm, that what was written thousands of years ago, maybe to our original audience, has a fuller meaning that even the original audience didn't understand what they were writing. But now, far removed, we now see. And so it has this predictive power to show its claims on nature to be true and confirmed by scientific inquiry and discovery. Also, because of the physical constants and laws that are changeless that God instituted at the beginning of creation, in the beginning of the universe, nature can also reveal truth. And this is also where they get a lot of their cosmology studies, cosmologist studies, is because the light is the speed of light is constant. And so you can measure distance, and therefore you can measure time based upon the distance and the speed. You can measure the time at which it reaches. So looking back in time, you can use the constants of light. And so this is how nature can reveal something about the universe and something about God. This is why the book of nature works, is because of the constants and laws are constant, they're changeless. And so there is a harmony in their messages. What scripture, this predictive power of scripture, what it makes about nature throughout its testament, and then also what nature and its constants and laws testifies back. And so there's this overlap, this significant overlap and harmony between what scripture says and what science proves. And so old earth creationists believe that God progressively created the earth over time, as scripture reveals in Genesis 1 creation week, which we'll talk about. They see God progressively creating. And so day 2 is built upon what God did in day 1, and day 5 is built upon what God was doing in day 3, 4, and 5. In 4, 3, 2, 1. And so they see natural evolution when it comes to evolution. So they see the earth is old and the universe is old, but they see natural evolution happening really only at the species level, with higher level animals, more complex levels of animals, and lower form of animals. Natural evolution will happen only at the genus level. And so there's not this speciation happening with evolution. They don't see that. And so they also, interpretive-wise, exegetical-wise, hermeneutically-wise, they see the Hebrew word for day found in Genesis 1, or yom, referring to not a literal 24-hour period, right? So the word yom in the Hebrew can have 4 different meanings. And so one of the meanings is not just a literal 24-hour day, but an epoch of time, an age of time. This is where we get the word day-age view, that how we interpret day is that it's an age or an epoch of time that it was talking about. So maybe when Moses, that we believe to be the author of Genesis, penned that on the first day God said, "Let there be light," right? That maybe that day was not referring to a literal 24-hour time, but an epoch of time. God was saying, "Let there be light." And so in Genesis 1 through 3, I want us to walk through this together. Genesis 1 through 3 says this: "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters." Verse 3 says, "And God said, 'Let there be light,' and there was light." So in verse 1 and 2, just to give you an illustration of the old earth creationist view and hermeneutic, is that in verse 1 and 2, we have more of this panoramic view of God creating something out of nothing. Creatio ex nihilo. God created something out of completely nothing. And by the way, we see this in science with the Big Bang, that God created something out of nothing. There was nothing. And then something transcended. The first cause caused it to happen. And that was God. And Genesis 1:1 testifies to this, by the way. There's that predictive power, and the scientific discovery later on, right, has confirmed that. And so the universe is made along with the sun and the earth before anything else. And so early earth was covered in water and had a thick atmosphere, not letting any light in. So it was dark. It was fully covered in water. And guess what? As we studied early earth, it's described as being dark and covered with water at one point. Look at that. Again, the scripture has predictive power, and scientific discovery is confirming it. There's that overlap. Incredible. It's true what Romans 1:20 says, that the invisible qualities of God are shown in what is seen. Verse 3 says, and God said, let there be light, and there was light. We go from after verses 1 and 2 into less of a panoramic view and just someone standing on earth. And it said, then God said, let there be light. In Genesis 1, there are four major creation verbs that are used, bara, haya. And so in this instance, when God said, let there be light, he's not using bara, this poof-like miracle creating act, which God did in the very beginning. God created the heavens and the earth. He poof-like, he made it happen, the Big Bang, right? But in here, when in verse 3, God's not using that. God is actually just allowing light through a thick atmosphere. He's manipulating what's already there. Let it be. Let it be. Let's take what is already there and let's rework it like a potter with clay. And so God allowed light in through that thick atmosphere, and it was progressive. What was happening in day one set up the next day or epoch of time. It was progressive in that the life that he created set the stage for the next day or the next age. And so the sun made the earth really, really hot when light was allowed in. And so early life forms took care of the greenhouse gases that allowed the temperature to be lowered or maintained. And so again, one of the hallmarks of the old creationist view is that it's progressive, that what God was doing in the first day and so on and so forth in these epochs of time were building towards the diversity of life and the human civilization that we have today. The last view, so we've covered the young earth creationist view, the evolution creationist view, and the old earth creationist view. And the last view I want to share is known as ID, or the intelligent design view. It's unique because it doesn't make any claims on origin, but only searches for signs of an intelligent designer in defense of naturalistic evolutionary claims. And so their aim is to challenge the materialistic views of naturalistic evolution through scientific inquiry. Which points and highlights my last thought I want to share with you is this idea of the anthropic principle. That in cosmology, there are signs of and evidences of fine-tuning, that human existence is miraculous on a cosmological level. Things happen in just the right way to allow the earth to be filled with life. See, Jupiter, it protects us from asteroids and meteors. So we have a just right Jupiter, just the right distance from the earth for there to be life. We have the Earth, the galaxy is just the right galaxy, spiral galaxy, to allow a certain number of stars and gravitational energy and pools in the right places, allow for the Earth to exist and take care of life. The anthropic principle points towards the confirmation that there is an intelligent designer, there's a creator. Last thing I want to share with you is the idea that there are other creation scriptures other than Genesis 1 through 11. And oftentimes as Christians, we don't know that. We don't know that there are other creation texts, but there are. Look at Psalm 104. Look at verses 5 through 6. He says, he set the earth on its foundations. It can never be moved. He covered it with the watery depths as with a garment. The water stood above the mountains. Sound familiar? And Job 9, verse 9, says that he's the maker of the Bear and the Orion, the Pleiades and the constellations of the south. He made the stars in the heavens. Proverbs 8, 27 through 28. I was there when he set the heavens in place, when he marked out the horizon on the face of the deep, when he established the clouds above and fixed securely the fountains of the deep. Right? You can look at 1 Corinthians 15, Hebrews 1, Revelations 4. There's just a litany of scripture that refer to God creating that we can use to see an constructive integration with science and scripture. And so as I wrap up this last minute or two, does scripture and science have alignment? I think so. I think where it does align, there is harmony. And this points past creation and into redemption. That if the claims on creation are true, how much more real the claims on Jesus by Jesus. That if what is seen is confirmed, then what not seen is even more impactful. We have insight to heaven and hell, what scripture proclaims. And so I want you to understand also, there are challenges of both science and scripture. Scientists have to figure out how to answer the big questions, while believers have to figure out how scientific findings jive with scriptural claims. And so none of these views are perfect, but they are constantly being refined. I really appreciate the reasons to believe in their mission, by the way. They strive for biblical integrity and exegesis while integrating scientific discoveries. That's something to look into. And so lastly, I want to address the believer and the unbeliever. To the unbeliever, science is subject to worldview. If you're looking for a reason for God to not be real, you're going to find it. But if you're looking for a reason for God to be real, you're going to find that. See, there is enough fact to believe, and there's enough room that is unproven to not believe. It's both and. To the believer, we shouldn't be intimidated by the scientific claims. There is harmony. And guess what? We should test everything. We should stay curious, and we should lean into the mystery. I want to leave open for any questions. Please comment below or email me. I'll put my email below. And I'm going to leave a list of sources that you can use to confirm. Thank you so much for listening and tuning in. And again, ask any questions. I would love to follow up. Thank you.